like to introduce our presenters for today, Jess Clark and Alina Scheim. Enjoy the presentation.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jess Clark. Alina Scheim is here. She is my partner, and so she's currently trapped under our sick toddler, so will not be joining us face to face, but she's in the comments section. So if anyone has any questions for her specifically, please do it there. Also, she'll be answering questions in the comments section. She is with Resolve. She's the executive director and an instructor. So I'm Jess Clark. I'm the prevention manager at Solace Crisis Treatment Center, which is Santa Fe's Rape Crisis and Trauma Treatment Center. We are in the schools from 7th grade to 12th grade and college and beyond doing sexual violence prevention programming. Resolve is an organization that does violence prevention along a spectrum from culture change up through what's typically called bystander intervention, and then finally to what's typically called self-defense. They like to think of it as two wings of a bird. One is doing culture change and the other one is helping people with skills to navigate the world that they're living in right now. So Alina and I paired up to do this training, not just because we're married, but because so much of our programming is working with young people, which is incredibly important. And we wanted something that was looking also at the systems that young people are living in. That's working across what's typically called what is called the spectrum of prevention, or the social ecological model, and really trying to prevent change at multiple levels. You all are in schools with young people all the time. We go in, we do presentations. We know that multi-session presentations are effective and they do good things, but we do leave. And at the end of the day, if we don't equip adults who work with young people with skills to navigate those young people's lives, especially in relation to violence, that we can only go so far. So we paired up to create this presentation and looking at what are the factors in any kind of community, whether that is a family or school or larger community, that increase the risk of young people being targeted for child sexual abuse and really for all kinds of violence. So that's why we're here today. Alina and I are going to be talking, well, really me now, I'm going to be talking about sexual violence. That's what this session is about. But the way I talk about sexual violence is different than maybe some other folks. So at no point am I going to be talking about individual acts of violence or describing acts of violence in any kind of detail. I'm only going to be using theory. And that's because in workshops like this, even when they're in person, going into detailed stories about individual acts of violence, instead of helping us learn, it actually can keep us from learning, especially those of us who have experienced violence. It can create a barrier to us learning because we need to check out or get triggered or anything like that. And they don't really help us learn. Oftentimes, the big detailed stories are used to convince people to care. You all are here, which means you already care. I don't have to convince you that this is an issue. So we're going to ask the same thing of you all. So during our time together, please do not tell any detailed stories or any stories about individual acts of violence. We don't want to harm each other. Now, if there's something you want to talk to Alina or myself about, please, our emails are at the end of the presentation. Please email, call. Happy to talk with you about it, do some brainstorming, get you access to resources, anything you might need. All right, let me figure out one thing. Sorry about this, y'all. Alina, you've got the chat. We're good to go. I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. One moment. All right, nope, it's gone. Okay, so we're gonna ask that folks ask questions through the chat. It's gonna be a kind of back and forth thing. So please answer questions through the chat, ask questions through the chat. Alina's gonna cover a good bit of that. If there's something that we need to deal with out loud, we will, or talk about in more detail out loud, we can do that. If I want you to expand on something, I may ask you to unmute yourself so we can have more of a back and forth conversation. All right, let me see. I do need to see the chat. And one of the room hosts, I don't know why I'm having a hard time figuring it. Ah, I got it. All right, and we're good to go. Okay. So we're going to start with the way because most of us live in a world where we're exposed to some form of media. So we're going to start with the way that we have been taught about sexual violence specifically in the media. So for most of us, that has been done through programs like Law & Order SVU. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about the story that is told in Law & Order SVU. Not what happens in real life, but the story that is told, which are most of the time different things. So the first piece that Law & Order SVU goes into is the person who causes harm, the person who hurts a child or an adult, person who's typically called the predator or the perpetrator or the rapist, anything like that. The person who causes harm, how would we describe them? If you had one or two words, how would you describe that person? And again, this is not real life, this is on TV. So just go ahead and type that into the chat. Okay, predator, the aggressor, troubled, a stranger, yes. So if you were going to tell a young person to look out for that person, what word would you use? They look like a what kind of guy? Dangerous. How would they know that that person looks dangerous or scary? So there's a way that we typically teach young people about this, and that is through the creepy guy myth. We have creepy dude in the van. Do we agree? This is the story that's told more often than not. Creepy dude in the van. Young people say that this should actually just say free Wi-Fi. And we use some really specific words. Yeah, sorry, thank you, Jill. Yeah, we're talking about what it is on TV, not real life. And we have to talk about that because this is what is present in so many of our minds, even when we know the truth, because we've seen this story so many times. So creepy dude in the van, when I go into a 4th grade classroom, we know that over 92% of the time when a young person is harmed, they're harmed by someone they know, not the creepy dude in the van. But when we go into a 4th grade classroom to talk about child sexual abuse, the only thing they've learned up until that point is stranger danger. And that's because this is the story that's told over and over and over. So we use some very specific words to talk about the creepy dude in the van. And you all have already used a few of them. Things like dangerous, troubled, predator, aggressor. What other kinds of things do we call that person who's caused harm? The perpetrator, the boogeyman, yes, the child molester. What else? Go ahead and type that in. Yes, sick is a really big one, and we link it to mental health or mental illness. Pervert, creepy dude, monster. Thank you for monster. That is the #1 word that we call the person who causes harm. So we have this monster myth when we're talking about child sexual abuse. We have creepy dude in the van who is a monster, who is sick, who is wrong, who is evil. And the problem with this monster myth is that we have kind of 2, sometimes 3 problems. So the first thing is that it keeps people from recognizing harmful behaviors in people they know. Oh, thank you, Alina. Alina says there's often a moment where people say they don't want to type the certain words in there that are sometimes used, yes. So the first part is it keeps us from recognizing harmful behaviors in others. So let's say that there's a big case that is on the news and we live in a neighborhood and someone in our neighborhood has been abusing children and they were caught. And so the news station, they come to our neighborhood and they start asking us questions about this person. Well, what did you know? More often than not, the answer to that is, well, I never would have suspected. He seemed like a really nice guy. He just really kept to himself, or he was really helpful, but he was a really nice guy. We had no idea. We could have never suspected. And part of that is because we are looking for monsters. We're looking for people who are scary, when in fact, it's more often than not going to be the nice neighbor. Now, let's say we dug in a little further. Maybe we found out later that that nice neighbor, there was a new mom who moved to the neighborhood, and the person who caused harm went to go and help her with her groceries. And he said, "Hey, can I help you with your groceries?" And she said, No, I've got it. I'm good. He said, "No, come on, let me help." And she said, "No, really, I'm okay." He said, "You know what? This is what I do in the neighborhood. I'm really helpful. Come on, this is what I do. Let me help you." And finally she says, "Okay, fine." And we saw that happen. And what we saw was nice, helpful guy. But what was actually happening was he was testing her boundaries to see what he needed to do to get her to ignore her no. But more than that, he was testing our boundaries, the people watching. And what we saw was nice guy. We didn't see boundary violation. So it keeps us from recognizing harmful behaviors in others. And I keep using he right now. Are women sometimes people who harm children? Yes. Most of the time it is men, straight men, and women sometimes do this as well. So that's one piece. The second piece is that it keeps us from recognizing harmful behaviors in ourselves. Now, there was a survey done of college-aged men. I don't know if any of you have heard of David Lisak. He's well-known, very important researcher in sexual violence and sexual violence prevention. So he did a survey of college-aged men and asked them questions like, have you ever gotten someone intoxicated, drugged, or gotten someone drunk in order to have sex with them? Have you ever held someone down in order to have sex with them? Have you ever had sex with someone after they said stop or no? And then the last question was, have you ever raped someone? And what do you think their answer was? Even if they answered yes to all of the above questions. Yeah, it was no. Thank you for saying no. Thank you for the head nods. I appreciate it. They all said no. Why did they say no if all of those other actions are also rape? You can type it in. Also, if someone wants to, you're welcome to say that one out loud or unmute yourself. Yes, thank you, Melissa. They don't see themselves as rapists. The rapist is the creepy guy. Exactly, Crystal. The rapist is the monster. Not me. I am the captain of the football team. I am president of the student union or what have you. I'm not a rapist. Now, Joanna said they didn't see that what they were doing was wrong. Now, follow up. They did see those behaviors as being not okay. They just saw them as within the acceptable realm of not okay. They're like, yeah, I mean, like maybe that wasn't cool, but it wasn't rape, even though all of those things absolutely were. We were drunk, all of those pieces. Everything plays into justifying that behavior as, again, knowing that it's not okay, but being within the acceptable realm. So this monster piece, it really prevents us from seeing real harm in the world. The last piece is words like monster, evil, sick, wrong. They also are talking about other people. They're not talking about people in my community. So it makes us go like this. And it means that we treat sexual violence not as a community issue, but as an individual failing. It is the individual failing of either the person who causes harm or the person who is called the victim or the survivor. All right. And there we go. So sexual violence has a few components, especially when we're talking about child sexual abuse, that make it happen. Do you need me to speak a little bit louder? Is that better, Brian? Is that better for folks? All right, thank you, Brian. All right, so grooming is something most of you are probably pretty familiar with, but I'm gonna go into it really briefly. So it has a few components. One is it keeps adults around that child from seeing what's happening by manipulating their perceptions, by reducing the likelihood that the kid will be believed. And then the flip side is keeping the kid from telling by getting them to cooperate and going back into the manipulation of the adults around them. So grooming has two components. The first one is on the individual side, what the adult does to the child. So first, the adult uses tools of manipulation like threats. Everyone's pretty familiar with threats. Traps is a little newer for some folks. Traps is, so let's say somebody says, well, do you want to come listen to my classical music? That doesn't sound so appealing, but hey, do you want to come play that rated M Xbox game that I know you're not allowed to play at home? That sounds way more appealing. So it's something a kid wants to do that they're not technically allowed to do. And then if the adult harms them, then they can say, well, if you tell that I touched you, I will tell that you played that rated M Xbox game. So it traps them. Using flattery, which is we're going to get into later, but flattery being such an important component because adults who harm children choose children who they think need to be told that they are good and worthy. Bribery, everyone's familiar with bribery. And then most importantly, no one will believe you. Absolutely no one will believe you. This will come up later in how to respond to a disclosure. So we use threats to help guilt the child into going along, saying, I'll hurt your brother or dog or anything like that. Traps, this was your fault. Flattery, giving that child attention. Bribery is testing boundaries, and we'll get into more of that later. And no one will believe you, whether that's telling the child that they lie about everything so no one will believe you, or manipulating the adults around them. So that goes into the community side. So community grooming is the piece that's not talked about very often. Individual grooming is what most violence prevention has been about for child sexual abuse, but community grooming is really where we're moving. And what are the things that an adult does to keep the community from seeing what's happening and to keep them from intervening or believing the child, even if the child does disclose? So the first piece is to put themselves in a position of relative authority. It is not a coincidence that it is oftentimes the person who is the coach or the religious leader or teacher or respected community figure who is then found out to have caused significant harm. Because being in a position of relative authority means that they're not questioned, they're above reproach. The next piece is creating access to that child. We don't let people around our children typically who our children don't know. It's not an accident that most abuse is done by people kids know, because those are the adults who have access to children in our lives. Creating access goes right into gaslighting and introducing terms that we're going to unpack later. Being overly helpful, just like the person in that story and recognizing harmful behaviors in others, is normalizing little boundary violations that build up into a big boundary violation. Sexual abuse doesn't happen out of nowhere. Oftentimes, an adult does little things to test that child's boundaries and to normalize not listening to that child's no or not listening to their hesitation, so that when they do sexually abuse the child, it seems like something that's totally normal. And the last piece is being extremely nice and making themselves absolutely indispensable, because someone who's really nice, who's the most respected person in a community, is the last person we think about. Any questions about this before I move along? All right. So we have how a community is groomed, but then we have what makes a community targeted in the first place. What makes a community, for lack of a better term, and I really wish I had a better way to explain this, a good or a bad target. So these are some factors that make a community a good target for abuse, a community that is more likely to be targeted. Because adults who harm children typically do it over and over and over again and move from community to community, and they're looking for some really specific things. So the first one is that children are seen and not heard. We don't listen to children. It's really valuing children's obedience over all other things. Alina and I, we have a toddler together, and we just had her parent-teacher conference. And we noticed that so many of the things they were talking about, and this is what Micah does well, all of them were about obedience and really revering authority and going along and being extra helpful, which, being helpful is great, but those aren't the things we really value most in our child. We want them to talk about her independence. But a community that really values children going along and being obedient means that kid is more likely to listen to an adult who says, well, you have to listen to me because I'm an adult, which goes right into revering authority. It is not a coincidence that significant abuse, sexual violence, period, happens in communities like military. This is no surprise to them. They know this very well. They're actually responding better than most larger institutions currently. I have to listen to the chain of command. That means that I'm predisposed to not say no to someone who is in a higher position. A community that values and enforces rigid gender norms. So rigid gender norms meaning girls have to be this and boys have to be this. Not even going into transgender or anything like that, but girls are this and boys are this. This is the only way things are, and this is how you have to behave. So how this relates to child sexual abuse is a couple of levels. So the first one is it keeps boys from telling. When I go into a fourth grade classroom to talk about child sexual abuse, we talk with them about the fact that child sexual abuse happens to girls and boys about the same amount before they turn 13. But boys don't tell almost half as often as girls do. And I asked them, why is that? And these fourth grade boys, so I'm talking like 9, 10-year-olds, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, have no problem in every single class I've ever been in saying, well, that's because we need to be tough and strong and deal with it on our own, which is so heartbreaking to me that an 8, 9, 10-year-old boy, that any boy or man says, well, if I get harmed, I just need to deal with it on my own. It tells boys that if they ask for help, that they're less of a man, that they may as well be a girl, which we then tell them is the worst possible thing for them to be. So it makes it easier to target boys. On the flip side, if a community values rigid gender norms, that includes girls being passive. So on both sides, it keeps kids going along with the abuse and keeps them from telling. A community that values secrets. Alina and I did this in Los Alamos recently, and we just looked around the room when we brought this part up and said, well, and again, it's not a coincidence that significant numbers of sexual abuse and domestic violence happen in Los Alamos. It's a community that values secrecy and secret keeping. And while that community is not outwardly telling children, you should never tell about child sexual abuse, it's saying, here are all the things that we value, and secrecy is one of them. Now that can happen with big secrets, but also with little secrets, saying, well, don't tell mom I ate the last cookie. Or in a school setting, well, don't tell any kid, don't tell the other kids that I gave you a piece of candy. Now that adult is not harming the child, but they're normalizing secret keeping. A community that believes that holds up sexuality as a taboo. This is not something we talk about, uses lots of innuendo around sexuality, or uses incorrect words or not medical words for body parts. Even things like saying private parts. Private parts is talking about an area that is then saying that we talk about all parts of your body except for this. We don't name this, which tells children, oh, this is something to be ashamed of, which then if they're abused, well, I don't even have the name for that. So how can I talk about what happened to me? And saying that doesn't happen here. Some friends of Alina and I's were starting at a new daycare, and Alina and I talk about sexual violence all the time. It's our job, our poor child. And they started at this new daycare, and they asked the daycare, what is your policy in preventing child sexual abuse? And they said, oh, we don't have one because that doesn't happen here. We don't have to worry about that. And it gave them pause, but they really liked everything else about the school. So they started at the school. A couple of weeks in, they found out that their daughter, one day a week in aftercare, was just going to be her and one teacher, no other kids, no other teachers, and that the teacher happened to be a man. And it gave them pause. They said, and so they talked to the school about it. They said, hey, what are you doing to prevent child sexual abuse? You said you don't have a policy and this doesn't happen here, but this thing makes us uncomfortable. Maybe she just won't come that day. And the school responded terribly. They said, well, you are causing problems and you hate men. And they kicked them out of the school. And how dare you question our policies? And our friend said, well, had they had a clear sexual abuse prevention policy, we maybe wouldn't have even batted an eye at her being alone with this adult one day after school, which is not best practice anyway. But because the school so clearly said, that doesn't happen here, we don't have to worry about that, it made them really uncomfortable and is actually a factor that makes a school environment a really good target. A place where we don't talk about it means that it's a place where people are going to keep secrets, and a place where the abuse will go unseen and continue with not just that one kid, but possibly many. A community that really values being conflict averse, or if not values it, just won't deal with conflict. Conflict is not bad. Conflict is an important part of everyday life. And if we can't talk about hard things, then we can't talk about hard things. And that, of course, includes sexual abuse. And a community that values going along to get along. I don't want to be that guy and say the thing that makes me uncomfortable, whether that's at a school when I'm interviewing a school, or working in a school and seeing behavior from a faculty member that makes me uncomfortable. Well, if I say that thing, then I don't want to cause trouble. It means that it's a community that is a good target. Any questions about these moving forward? All right. So Alina typically does this piece because she teaches about intuition so much. So I'm going to go through it probably quicker than she does. So first we want to talk about intuition is a part of us responding to child sexual abuse. There's something in us that says something is wrong. We need to do something about this. Now, what are some things that keep us from responding? Some barriers to us listening to that intuition, that feeling? And you are welcome to type it in or say it out loud. We could know the person well. We don't want them to get in trouble. What if I'm wrong? And we're going to come back to that one in just a moment. What if I'm wrong has been really present in every single one of the sessions we've done. Again, not wanting to cause problems or rock the boat, feeling scared. That's just not something that could happen here. Thank you. All of those are really helpful. Oh, not knowing what to do if we then listen to that intuition, or knowing the systems or what the system will do. Repercussions for false reporting. Oh, that's interesting. Having other people support what's happening. Oh, this is my thing. It's not about them, especially if we are people who've experienced violence in the past. Not wanting to hurt the relationship with the child or the parents. And that person could be a friend. All of those are really big reasons that we don't listen to intuition or don't act on it. Worrying about, we've spent all of this time forming a really strong bond with this child or this family, and what if we say this thing and we were wrong, and now that relationship is ruined? Or what if we say something and we're right, but the system doesn't respond the way we want it to, and so the child is still with this family, but now we've hurt that relationship? All of those fears are very real, and not only present in this conversation. Those fears are present in every conversation we have. Now, before we come back to those, what does intuition feel like in your body? What are the thoughts that you experience? What are the physical sensations that happen when you're experiencing intuition? Because intuition isn't some made up thing, it's real. A knot in your stomach. I love that the gut is the one that comes up most often, is we just have this gut feeling. A nagging thought, something that keeps coming back and back and back and over and over and over. Chills, maybe hair on the back of your neck. Something that just doesn't feel right. Feeling that need to protect. Alina, when she talks about intuition, she says that she starts looking for exits and wondering what her physical defense strategy would be, even if the situation itself doesn't call for it. It's like, oh, something is wrong if I'm having this feeling that seems to be out of proportion with what's in front of me. Yeah. Anything else? What intuition feels like? that nagging thought, that over and over and over again. So all of those are huge, really, really important. Sometimes it's like heart racing. Sometimes it is, I just can't stop thinking about it. It just keeps coming back. So I'm going to go back to the barriers. And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong is something that comes up in every session and has a lot of presence. That feeling of what if I'm wrong is actually a sign of intuition. Is doubting ourselves is a sign of intuition. It's a sign that we're actually right. What if I'm wrong means sometimes I'm actually right and need to listen to this feeling. We humans have been a lot of the times trained to not listen to our intuition because of those barriers, or because we did listen and we experienced backlash, or because if we were told to keep things nice, to not rock the boat, then we don't listen because it will rock the boat. The other piece is, what if I'm right? Is a huge barrier. What if I'm right and this has to change either the life of the child that I care about who is in my school, or a life of a child who I care about in my community, or the person who's caused harm who I might also care about? Because again, these are people in our community, not the creepy dude in the van. So all of these keep us from acting, keep us from intervening. And again, those are really good reasons, really important barriers that keep us from intervening. And when we intervene, even when we have to move past those barriers, we not only possibly change the life of the child who's being harmed, but also we can change ourselves in that moment because we've just learned how to better listen to our intuition. Every time you practice something, you get better at it, and that includes listening to intuition. Any questions, comments about that? Anything you want to say, Alina? She's much better at that part than I am. Okay, so Alina's good to go. All right, so now we have, on the flip side, the things that keep a community safer, the things that make a community, again, for lack of a better term, a bad target for child sexual abuse. So the first piece is that children are given, and I put this in parentheses because it's so important, curated choices. Have any of you worked in early ed or worked with littles? Awesome, thank you, Jill. So anytime I bring this up with groups of folks in pre-K, they say, what, you're gonna let them run the classroom and they're gonna run around smearing glue in each other's eyes? No, we give children curated choices. It does not mean they run the show. It does not mean they walk all over us or roll all over us. It means that whenever possible, which is almost always, we give children choices, that we're okay with both of the options. We do this in parenting, in educating. So for those of you that are school nurses, it might mean, hey, you just fell, you need a Band-Aid. You are 5 years old and you're really scared, and so you're now resisting me putting a Band-Aid on you, or antiseptic, or whatever it might be. Do you want to do it sitting up or lying down? Do you want this Band-Aid or this Band-Aid? Do you want to hold your friend's hand or this special teddy bear that I have in my office? What do you need to feel like you have some sort of agency in this? Alina and I do this with our child, and it is a constant mind exercise. It's exhausting to try to come up with a choice in almost everything because she's 2.5 and so resists basically everything, whether she wants it or not. Alina's tactic that I love for giving medicine is, do you want it sitting up or lying down? We need to get you to take this medicine to keep your body safe and healthy. Do you want it sitting up or lying down? I need you to wear underwear. Do you want these ones or these ones? I need you to wear shoes. Do you want these ones or these ones? And explaining the why behind it. Holding our hand when we walk down the street across the street is really important. Do you want to hold one of our hands or both? Do you want to hold on to my index finger, whatever that finger is called, or my pinky, we create curated choices, especially for children that have already been harmed. children who have already been sexually abused are more likely to experience subsequent abuse or sexual violence. And so much of that is because they've had their agency taken away, they've had their choices taken away, which means they are predisposed to be targeted again. So anytime, for especially children who have already been harmed, we're giving them more and more curated choices. We're helping protect them against future violence. That's why reporting is for children that are 13 and over, if you're not in the public schools, is so different, and that we try to let them have as much choice in that as possible. So number one, children are given curated choices. They do not run the show. They just get to have a say in how their lives work. And the cool thing about that is, if you're in a classroom, I know a few of your school social workers or school counselors, is children, when they're given curated choices, the power struggles lessen significantly. You get a choice in this, which means you're not digging in your heels as much. I know that's how I feel about the world. So I'm sure I know it's even more so for young kids. The second piece is that choice absolutely has to extend to bodily autonomy, has to extend to choices about their body. This is a really hard part to talk about, especially because in families, this becomes an incredible point of contention in that it feels like a rejection of the family. So in my family, it is really important to my family that when you go to a family gathering, you go around and you say hello to everyone, you give everyone a hug or a kiss, that especially people who are older than you. That is incredibly important in my family. Now, I remember growing up and really not wanting to hug an uncle. He never harmed me. He was just really mean. He was really mean, and he smelled terrible. He was a chain smoker and smelled like a giant ashtray at all times. But I was expected to go up and hug him and say, "Oh, it's so good to see you," and give him a big hug. And he always wanted to kiss me on my forehead. I didn't like it, but I always had to do it. That taught me that my body was not my own, that I did not get to have choices about my body. We send children really mixed messages. We say, yes, your body belongs to you, except for when I say it doesn't, except for when another adult wants to hug you, even if you don't want it. So in introducing this idea to my family, Alina was really great, and said, because in my family, any rejection of a family norm feels like a rejection of the family, which could feel like a rejection of culture, of history, of religion, whatever it is. And so hers was, hey, family, we really want to protect our child against child sexual abuse. We know that this is a huge issue in New Mexico. Will you be a part of our protective team? Will you help us? And invite them into a process instead of feeling like we're pushing them away. Now, our kid still has to say hello and be nice, or be kind, not nice, kind and respectful. But she can do that with a wave, with a high five, or with a hug if that's what she chooses. So a lot of these are going to be the flip side of the risk factors. So a community that has expansive gender roles for the inverse reasons of the risk factors. A community that has healthy sexuality education, which means that young people have access to information. When young people have access to information, they're less able to be manipulated when it comes to sexual abuse, sexual violence. That means from a young age, we teach children the proper names for their body parts. I take my kid into the men's restroom, and she likes to yell very loudly, "I wipe my own vulva," which is awkward for me, but I know is going to serve her in the long run. That means, nurses, you all are doing such an important job when you're teaching that reproductive health, such an important job in giving young people access to information. The inverse of that couldn't happen here. That could happen in here. That could happen here. This is something we talk about. One of the things we do through Resolve and Solace is we provide technical assistance and an environmental scan to community organizations. And one of the questions we ask is, when you're interviewing new staff members, do you ask the question, what do you think our organization should do to prevent against child sexual abuse? Now, there aren't any perfect answers. There are a couple of bad answers. But most importantly, just the presence of that question is telling someone who might be interviewing our organization for, is this a place where I can get away with child sexual abuse? It's saying, whoa, they talk about that here. This is not a good target. I can't get away with this here. So just the presence of that question alone is a protective factor. A community that says we do not keep secrets. There's a difference between secrets and surprises. Surprises, they find out, but we talk about things, we talk about hard things, we practice having difficult conversations with little things so that they build up to bigger things. Communities that help children have a positive sense of identity, not in spite of who they are, but because of it. That is especially true for LGBTQ plus and youth with disabilities. Being told that you are less worthy because of this piece of you, or being told that, oh yes, you are worthy, even though you have that thing about you, that means that those young people are more likely to be targeted. Youth with disabilities and LGBTQ youth experience sexual violence at higher rates than basically everybody else, and especially youth with disabilities. And then we have some larger societal protective factors that I know we don't have absolute control of in our roles, but we can advocate when they come up. And that is things like paid leave. When families are paid to stay home, it means they're not put in the position of making childcare decisions that might not be what they wanted, but were the best that they could do. My parents had to do a lot of making decisions about childcare that didn't put me in the safest positions, but it was the best that they could do. Similarly, having childcare assistance so folks can get their kids into accredited programs through CYFD assistance. And then having licensure for those programs for anyone who's working with young people that includes sexual assault prevention training. All of us have to go through reporting training, but not necessarily how do we prevent it in the first place. And then things agencies can do, so that could be a school or a community organization, is looking at how we hire beyond background checks. What are we doing to prevent against child sexual abuse? Having all of those practices be written policy, including things like secrets. Having policy be nurses at this school will not ask, any faculty at this school will not ask a student to keep a secret, either from parents or other students. Having clear policies on reporting that include things like a supervisor cannot prevent someone from reporting, because that supervisor could have a vested interest in that story not getting out. Being really transparent about what's happening in a school. Alina and I were invited into a school after some abuse had happened a few years ago, and the abuse had happened and then school went on break. And the first thing they did was when they came back together, was bring us in to talk about it, to talk about what the teachers were feeling. And we didn't have to go into any of the minutia of the abuse itself. We just talked about, hey, what does this feel like for you, instead of having it be brushed under the rug. And then looking at things like physical spaces. Are there windows on doors, or are doors left open? Having extensive training for staff. And then how do we utilize volunteers, and how are we background checking them? But also, are parent volunteers who go on a field trip allowed to help other children in the bathroom, or help them with clothing changes, things like that, that should be written into policy, not just general accepted practices. And I'm speeding up because I always run out of time, so here we are. All right, so hands up or type it in the chat for any of you who have received a disclosure from a student. A student has told you that they have been abused. Okay. So this comes with some really hard feelings for the person receiving that disclosure. I've received hundreds of disclosures from children. It never gets easier. And I try so hard to treat those disclosures like a gift. This child is trusting me with their story. They're trusting me with their lives. Receiving that disclosure can be easier or harder based on what we do and based on how we've been trained in responding to that disclosure. Most of us, this was not a part of our training. Is, oh, a kid tells you what beyond reporting is, what do I actually say to this child in that moment? So first I'm gonna go through the don'ts to just get them out of the way. So the first part is, please do not investigate. Do not ask follow-up detailed questions about what happened to that child. The after-school special thing of here's the teddy bear, show me where it happened. No, do not do that. There's a few reasons for that. One is we're not trained investigators. Two is we could be putting that child into a story that they're not ready to tell in detail right now, which could keep them from telling it all later. And three is you're not the last person they're going to have to talk to. And what happens when we tell our story over and over and over again? Go ahead and type that in. Or unmute yourself, either way. All right, I'm just going to go for it. It changes. It re-traumatizes them and it can change. So a few years ago, I got bit by a donkey, not a dog, a donkey. And what was once a 10-second story is now like a 10-minute saga that I act out, not because I'm lying, but because our funky human brains do that. The story changes over and over and over, not because children are lying, but because that's how their brains work, which means that it can hurt the investigation. So the second piece is we don't make promises. You will never have to see that person again. I will make sure that you are totally safe. The system is not perfect. The system is far from perfect. And we cannot make those promises. And that could hurt our further relationship with the child if we weren't able to keep that promise that we made. The third is blame. That means right with investigation, investigation can sound like blame. You know, when you've come home from a hard day at work and you're telling your person all about it and they start asking a whole bunch of follow-up questions. Well, did you do this? Well, how about this? That feels like they are now blaming you for the hard day that you had. Also, because we live in a culture that blames adults and children for sexual abuse, especially girls, those ideas, they work into our brains whether we want them to or not, and they can come out sideways. Don't talk about your feelings. That's a really hard thing, especially when we have legitimate emotional reactions to a child we care about being harmed. But what it does is if a child tells me that they've been harmed and I respond with anger or disbelief or sadness or whatever, that child then goes, oh no, my words are hurting this adult who I care about. And so they just stop talking. So forensic interviewing is something that's done across the state in what are called child advocacy centers. We have one at Solace. And our forensic interviewers, they're not therapists or law enforcement. They're just everyday people who are trained to talk to children and get their story. And their story's recorded so they don't have to tell it over and over again. And law enforcement's in the other room so they don't have to interact with them or feel like they've done something wrong. They don't re-traumatize the child. The interview is child-led. And they do not react to anything the child says. So the child can say the most horrific thing and the interviewer will not react, which gives that child what is oftentimes their one opportunity to tell their story without any adult emotional interference, which is so important in their path to healing. Don't speak badly about the person causing harm. I don't know if any of you have had a friend who broke up with that person who you just really disliked, and they break up with them and you're like, oh, thank goodness, they blah, da, 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 da. And then what happens 2 weeks later? They get back together and suddenly your friend's not calling you anymore. That dynamic gets especially hard and harmful with domestic violence because domestic violence thrives in isolation. That dynamic gets especially harmful with children who've experienced child sexual abuse because oftentimes they're harmed by someone they love and care about, or at least have conflicting feelings about. And so speaking badly about the person who caused harm can actually make that child stop telling. They can keep that child from engaging in any kind of path to healing. So instead, we can do what Alina calls violence is bad. We can say that what happened to you isn't okay. And we thank you, Jackie, for 5 minutes left. And we don't involve people outside of the protocol. So if you're a teacher or a school counselor, it doesn't mean you have to go tell all of the other counselors. It means you tell the people who are designated at your school. So now what to do? Now, all of this is going to sound like an after-school special. These words have come from survivors saying, this is what I wish people would have told me. So it might sound a little cheesy, and it is so important. Thank you for telling me. I like this because it is affirming to the child in that moment, but it also gives you a second to think about what you're going to say next. I believe you, because oftentimes they've been told that no one will believe them. So it can be that first step to healing, move to healing. This isn't your fault. Again, children are so often told that this was their fault, that they made it happen. No, this is not your fault. And you don't have to know all the details to know that it wasn't their fault. Any child being harmed, it is not their fault. No one deserves to be hurt. This is the flip side of the speaking badly about the person and what Alina calls violence is bad. No one deserves to be hurt. Everyone deserves to be safe. You're not alone. This has happened to other kids, and we do this without sharing our own personal stories, especially if we're not able to share those stories without having our own significant emotional response in that moment, because it's not about us in that moment. And we can get help for ourselves in other places. I have to get help. I can't keep this as a secret. And there is help. And if it sounds confusing to the child, so if they say something like, well, but my body liked it, which is oftentimes the case, because bodies have physiological responses whether we want them to or not, we can say, that sounds really confusing. Or if they say, but I really love them, that sounds really confusing. And then we take care of ourselves. We debrief with only the appropriate staff. We do something to take care of ourselves because this is a huge burden. We try to integrate that child back into activities. There's this weird idea that we should just then cloister the child in the nurse's office or the counselor's office for the rest of the day, which makes them feel like they've done something wrong. So we integrate them back into activities if possible, and then pull them out if CYFD comes or law enforcement or what have you. If it happened in front of other children, we tell them how to respond. We say, hey, you know, they may not want to talk about this. Or when someone tells us something about themselves, if they're young, it's a gift. What do we do when someone gives us a gift? We say thank you, all of those things. And then we report and follow all guidelines around reporting that I will not go into today. Okay, I got through it. All right. So questions on anything we brought up? I think we have just a minute or so, and then Head to Toe is going to do a couple of pieces. Yes, we present at schools, and we can definitely do this as a webinar. If you're far away, we can do this as a webinar for your school. And with smaller groups, we can do it really interactive and longer. We can do this as a multi-session webinar where it's this information and then we do some practice later. Awesome, yes. Please take our information. We can also do technical assistance and environmental scans with organizations. That includes schools. That means looking at their policies and coaching them in how to update them to better protect against child sexual abuse.